Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on enlargement at the Bruegel Annual Meetings 2024. I'm Heather Graby, Senior Fellow at Bruegel, and I'm delighted that we're joined by two distinguished speakers very much at the heart of the enlargement process. We have Gert-Jan Koopman, the Director General of DG Enlargement here in Brussels, and joining us in person, thank you very much for coming from Chisinau for this, we have Christina Gerasimov, who's the Chief Negotiator and Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration of the Republic of Moldova. So today we're going to talk about what happens over the next 5 years. And what's really interesting about enlargement is that the momentum is back. 5 years ago, when we published the first Bruegel memo on enlargement in 2019, the situation was pretty dire. Not much going on in the Western Balkans, backsliding, which has continued, unfortunately, in democracy and the rule of law in some of the candidate countries, most notably Serbia, and not much enthusiasm, frankly, on the EU side. All of that has now changed with the geopolitical urgency brought by the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 by Russia, and also by a growing concern and understanding on the EU side that enlargement is a geopolitical necessity, and it's also the EU's most successful foreign policy. Personally, I've worked on enlargement since 1996. I have never seen Paris more enthusiastic about enlargement in all those years. So this geopolitical dimension is fundamental to the politics of enlargement. But the economic challenges are still enormous. Economic challenges around getting enough investment to ensure that economies can grow and prosper, get closer to the EU, and also challenges around governance, which the enlargement process also has to tackle, because these are future members of the EU. They're not just third parties. So what we're going to do this morning is I will present briefly the Bruegel memo on enlargement that I've written together with my colleague Zsolt Darvas, a very well-known economist who's worked on enlargement for a long time. We will then have some responses to the memo from those who know the current realities, and a discussion about how to tackle the challenges ahead, and then you will have an opportunity to bring in your own questions and comments. And for those of you online, please feel free to join us on Slido. I think that the hashtag is enlargement, but I actually don't have it in front of me, so I will confirm that. But if you go onto the Bruegel Annual Meetings site, you will certainly find it there. So you can also start putting up questions on Slido if you like. So, to give you just the key points that we make in the memo, this enlargement has a security dimension that no previous enlargement ever had. It's the first one that is actively opposed by a hostile power that is doing everything it can to prevent the enlargement through military aggression and also through hybrid warfare, through disinformation campaigns across all of the candidate countries and in notable parts of the European Union. We also have a difficult starting point because of the inconsistent application of accession conditionality in the Western Balkans over the past years, where there's been democratic principles violated, but the EU did not react very strongly. We've also seen other countries that have made considerable progress, especially in resolving bilateral disputes, which were not then rewarded with progress. So there's ground to make up in terms of restoring the credibility of the accession process, and particularly of the conditions. But on the other hand, we can see the way that the transformative power of the EU can still be used. It can still catalyse domestic reforms, especially when there's a sense of momentum, when the public has a sense that enlargement is perhaps just one election away. It's within the time horizon of this government or the next one. So it's vital to remove blockages such as bilateral disputes in order to boost the conditionality. And we argue for streamlining the negotiations. We think that the next commissioner should work to reduce the number of veto points, which amount to nearly 150, according to EU officials who've looked carefully at this, in the process, and also to ensure that there's some kind of new mechanism to resolve bilateral disputes. We also argue that the EU should involve the candidate countries progressively in EU policies along the way towards accession. In the 2004 enlargement, most of the integration happened after the countries actually joined in May 2004. This time it needs to be done differently because of the aggression and the opposition to enlargement. So the integration needs to happen faster to bring benefits to citizens more quickly, especially because they need those benefits in terms of a more reliable and cheaper energy supply. So bringing the candidates into Repower EU, the European Green Deal, aspects of green infrastructure building would bring those benefits immediately to citizens and, of course, reduce the influence that Russia exerts through the fossil fuel industry in the Western Balkans, but also through energy supply in Ukraine and Moldova. And we also argue that on the EU side, it's very important to combat some of the myths that have grown about enlargement. So Zsolt, my colleague, and our other economists at Bruegel have done a rather detailed calculation of how much would it really cost the EU budget to bring in all of the current candidates. And it's much less than you often read about in some of the back-of-the-envelope calculations. It's not only a lot less, it's about 0.17% of EU GDP, 26 billion a year, but that's under the current budget rules, which are bound to change. The EU budget is not written in stone, and in fact there will be a new budget proposal made by the Commission next year. There are some major negotiations ahead, as of course, as you all know from the first session, Bruegel is arguing for major changes to the common agricultural policy. So the budget will change, and there's always the possibility of using transition periods to ease the impact on the current net recipients of the EU. So it's something of a red herring, this budget issue. We also think that it's not necessary at all, it would be very counterproductive for the EU to make institutional reform a prerequisite for enlargement. In practice, the EU has never deepened before it enlarged. The EU has always done institutional reform after a major enlargement. That's when the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, after the failure of the Constitutional Treaty. That was after the 2004 enlargement. We also have seen that in previous smaller enlargements before the Big Bang. It's just incredibly difficult to do institutional reform until the very last minute. And so that last minute tends to come after midnight, after new countries have joined. And to make institutional reform a prerequisite for enlargement would block enlargement without necessarily getting institutional reform. But that doesn't mean the EU can't make progress along the way. As we've argued in the Bruegel memos to the presidents, there needs to be a big expansion of qualified majority voting. That could also happen, by the way, in parts of the accession process, in our view. So there's a lot that can be done on the institutional side without having a thoroughgoing treaty reform before enlargement. So that's just a taster of some of the proposals that we make, and I invite you to read them in the Bruegel memos. And I'd like to invite our distinguished guests to comment on those proposals and what they've read in the memo. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult for Gert-Jan because you've got a new commissioner who hasn't yet been named and who'll be arriving and will have his or her own views on the subject. But you've worked on enlargement for quite a while now. You have a number of new initiatives that you've taken in the past years. What do you find helpful and in the memo, and what would you add to it that we left out?
Thank you very much, Heather, and good morning to all of you. Well, actually, I find myself very pleasantly surprised by your memo, because a lot of it could have been written by the Commission, and some of these things we have actually already done. So it's very convergent with our own thinking. Let me pick up on a few points. Progressive integration, gradual integration. This is actually something that is happening as we speak, and under the growth plan for the Western Balkans, this is actually fundamental. And what is very interesting is not just the economic significance in terms of bringing some of the benefits forward, but the political momentum it generates in terms of bringing leaders together every few months and combating the cynicism that exists in some parts of our neighborhood about EU membership. So the new dynamic in the Western Balkans is very much due to the new growth plan, which is a prime example of progressive integration. And in fact, sitting next to Christina here, Moldova and Ukraine benefit from the DCFTA, which is another form of progressive integration. We have the energy community, the transport community, actually very much a means of bringing these countries into large parts of the EU system at an early stage. So I think that's the way to go. It's essential because I think the experience of the Western Balkans has shown that if you decouple the timeline for accession from the benefits of accession, it's simply very hard to sustain the reform. So we're changing that dynamics. Fully agree. I also personally fully agree with what you said about widening and deepening. We need to deepen, clearly. We need reforms internally. We've always been making reforms. The budget will be reformed. It's reformed every time we have a new multi-annual financial framework. And at the same time, this has never been a precondition for enlargement, even if it is important, and if enlargement puts a premium on these reforms. So these things go hand in hand, but they shouldn't be made conditional on one another. And I think that's really important in order not to gridlock enlargement. And finally, if we look at the momentum that is now out there, it is indeed very much a combination of a realization of the geopolitical challenges that we're confronted with, but also I think a genuine effort, the genuine effort made by the candidate countries and the energy that they are investing in it, and I think Moldova is a prime example of it, has also made this very credible. And I think maybe this is not what the man in the street, the proverbial man in the street, sees, but if you talk to our member states, they actually see that countries like Moldova, Ukraine, or Montenegro, which has now cleared the final hurdles as it descends its plane to the runway, they're actually making deep reforms in their system. So that is added momentum. At the start of the previous Commission, we were negotiating with 3 countries. We're now negotiating with 7 countries, and there's one on the way. So this is a very different world we live in.
Super. Thank you very much for that overview, and thank you especially for going into more detail on the Western Balkans. We had, as I think some of you will have seen online, 2 other speakers for this session, Milica Delevic and Igor Zhovka, both of whom couldn't attend for different reasons. I just wanted to let you know that we are also talking about those countries very much as well. And this tangible progress on progressive integration is really important because it's the thing that citizens also start to notice. They start to feel part of the EU. And I think also really vital for pushing back Russian disinformation about what EU membership actually involves. So, Christina, from the point of view of Moldova, now just starting negotiations, which is really terrific, and coming from a difficult situation, difficult in terms of a lot of pushback from Russian disinformation in the country. You've got now a referendum coming up on EU integration. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that. But also, in terms of the memo, how much do you think progressive integration is possible for Moldova, starting as it does from a low level of income, small country with low level of income, not a huge amount of administrative capacity, so a lot of political will to move faster. But how feasible is it to do that?
Thank you, Heather, and thank you very much for having me here today. I'm happy to share some of the views from Chisinau. First of all, congratulations on the memo. I think it's very well reflective of the processes in the candidate countries, but also the reflections and the processes within the Commission. I will start by saying that 4 years ago, for Moldova, we couldn't even dream of having opened accession talks with the EU. For us, this is something that we're still digesting as we move on. 4 years ago, we were discussing about the need of deep reforms, and here, of course, the EU had a significant role to say. However, what very well is reflected in your memo, it was because of the tragic war, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that revived this dialogue on EU enlargement and gave us the opportunity to be where we are today. So within less than half a year after we have applied for after we've applied for EU membership, we got the candidate status. I remember those days when during the day we were managing a refugee crisis that we haven't ever seen before. And during the night shift, we were filling out the questionnaire from DG NEAR. We've managed within less than half a year to get the candidate status. And indeed, this has been a result not only of a very strong political will at home, but of course of the tragic geopolitical situation in the region. And within less than 2 years, we've managed, after fulfilling the 9 recommendations of the Commission, to get a green light from the Council to start negotiations. During these, let's say, almost 3 years now, Moldova has gone through deep transformations. I'll just give an example. In our energy sector, we were 100% dependent on Russian gas. And today, Moldova is 0% dependent on Russian gas. The Transnistrian region is still something different, but we have managed to diversify our energy mix. We buy gas from the market, and this has, of course, been done also with the significant support of the EU. So here I have to say that having access to the electricity grid, decoupling, has been a process that many countries go through years. We've managed to do it pretty quickly. This is an example where I would say, having access to certain EU projects, programs, gives us impetus for our own strengthening of our economy, our democracy. So here, I'll just have to say that progressive integration or gradual integration is something that we are very much interested in, because it really underpins the very comprehensive reforms that we need to undergo regardless, because these reforms, we're doing them for our own citizens, for our own good, and having this incentives and support coming from the EU very much helps us accelerate certain processes that otherwise would have taken much longer. I will just give another example, reforms in the judiciary, for instance. For us, this has been the backbone of the 9 recommendations from the Commission after we received the candidate status. A lot of the things that we've managed to do, we would have done regardless, but we've managed to do them much faster, because we were in a process where we were closely cooperating with the Commission, with the EU member states on the next steps of the EU accession process. So here I can say that a lot of the things that we've managed to do by this June, before the first intergovernmental conference, a lot of it has had the impetus of the recommendations that were in a way done by the Commission to get to the next step. So here I would say that indeed progressive integration is our way to go. Having access to SEPA would be our next step, and this is something very important for us, particularly for the people to understand very well the concrete practical benefits of the EU. I have to also, of course, mention that all of this happens on a very difficult background of security challenges. At the same time, while we are not dealing with hardcore threats coming from Russia, we are in a hybrid warfare with Russia. And here, the disinformation about the EU, about what the EU stands for, the legitimacy and credibility of the EU is very much a tool that Russia uses to, and there is other aspects that could strengthen our security and our resilience back at home. I'll just finish here on bringing in the referendum that you have mentioned. On 20th of October, we have the presidential elections and a referendum where we will strategically decide on our European path. This is something that, we, the Moldovan people, need to decide as a society, the geopolitical direction that we're taking as a country. This will facilitate the efforts, the tremendous amount of efforts that goes into the efforts that the government needs to put in, that the society needs to put in. But I think this is the right way to go now as we embark on this very transformative path of reforms as a country, as a society. Again, this goes against a very strong background of disinformation. We're working a lot with the EU delegation on the ground to, promote the right messages and give more information, communicate more to the people what are the benefits of the EU, and here we could do more together. So these are just some of the things that you've reflected in your memo, but are very much our day-to-day living in Moldova.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you for that reminder that there's a tendency sometimes on the EU side to take for granted that there are going to be pro-EU governments in candidate countries, and that's absolutely not the case. The Moldovan election will be very fiercely contested. The referendum is not a foregone conclusion, and we've seen also in the Western Balkans anti-EU political leaders coming to the fore, also ones which have professed their interest in joining the EU, but not their interest in European values or meeting the EU standards, particularly when it comes to rule of law or indeed issues like Russian influence in their country, Russian purchasing of strategic assets and so on. So I wanted to come to this issue that Christina just mentioned about reform of the judiciary and independence of the judiciary, which is a challenge in many countries, both candidate countries, also a couple of countries inside the European Union. The Polish government is struggling pretty hard to regain independence of the judiciary. Once judiciaries have become infected with politics and indeed with corruption, it's actually very hard to change the situation. Moldova's been praised in the Commission's progress reports for its work in this area, but there's still some way to go. This is a challenge also in Ukraine, also in most of the Western Balkan countries. So, Hedjan, how do you see rule of law conditionality? So rule of law meaning independence of the judiciary, but also media freedom, also ensuring consistent application of EU law, which is fundamental to the Copenhagen criteria for membership. How to make the administration work in accordance with what should be the highest standards of rule of law, especially given the undermining of rule of law in some of the EU member states. In the memo, we propose several ways of doing this. For example, making the candidates part of the rule of law annual reports on the member states, so having an enlarged kind of monitoring process, but also sharpening the conditionality. Is it feasible to do that, or is that going to be undermined because some of the EU member states don't want it and they wouldn't like to see post-accession conditionality that might apply to them as well?
Well, Heather, I think it's worth maybe taking a step back and looking at how we've structured the enlargement negotiations. In fact, the rule of law, independence of judiciary, this whole complex is part of what we call the fundamentals linked to the Copenhagen criteria, and they're the heart of the accession process. In fact, we open the negotiations by opening this cluster. It's organized the negotiations are organized in clusters. And we can provisionally close other clusters, but the last cluster that is closed is the fundamentals cluster. So all along the process, this is at the heart of what we do. Many of the recommendations in our enlargement package are really focused on this. It's, in my service, the biggest priority for the work with the candidate countries. And I think it's very good that we are now integrating, as the President has already said, the countries in the rule of law mechanism. But actually we have a much more powerful tool already today, which is the accession process itself. This is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because these recommendations be it for opening negotiations, as was the case in Moldova, but also for the Balkan countries in the enlargement reports. This is going to be determinant. And I think what progressive integration brings is actually a very interesting set of incentives where, as you move forward, you need to make some of these changes. One example, single euro payment area. You already mentioned SEPA. This is hugely important. It saves the Western Balkans 500 million euros a year once they're in. We now have 3 countries that are likely to be in by the 1st of January. They're racing forward. Mm-hmm. But this isn't a free lunch. You have to work for it. What do you need to do? You need to adopt AML, CFT legislation. And you need to adopt other legislation, such as the Payment Directive.
Can I just spell out 2 of the acronyms for the audience? So SEPA is the Single European Payments Area, which would allow people in the Western Balkans who get a huge amount of their income through remittances in euro at the moment to convert that into local currency costs them a lot of money. So it would make a big difference. So they have to adopt AML, anti-money laundering legislation. So just to spell out for the audience what this is about. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So you basically need to clean up your banking system, provide transparency, meet European standards, which are amongst the highest in the world here, in order to be able to benefit. So there's a choice here, right? And what you see, and I'm very happy to observe this, is that the hesitations that prevailed, in this case in the Western Balkans, to do some of these things, are now actually being brushed aside, and there is a race to the top. So there is competition amongst the countries to get in quickly because the benefits are so large. You're talking about saving 20 to 30% potentially on single transactions. So if you wire as an expatriate worker in Germany 100 euros into any of the Western Balkan countries, today you lose between 15 and 30 euros. It's really shocking. It's even more if you wire money between the countries. All of this would go once you actually comply. So you know, it's very hard to explain to your citizens if next door, in this case in Montenegro, which is the front runner for this, people can do this for free.
Yeah.
And you know, you're sitting there and you're saying, well, actually, sorry, you guys have to pay 15 euros for your 100 euros transfer. So what I'm trying to say is that progressive integration is actually adding a booster to this mechanism. And I think, if I may, we need to be very focused on results here. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk, sorry to say, there's a lot of talk about rule of law, but ultimately the recommendations that we're making are precise, they're assessed objectively, and unless they are met, there is not going to be any progress. And with the incentives I've just mentioned, the motivation to do this is strong. So I think it's wonderful to have them in the rule of law mechanism. It's great, but that is still a bit of a talking shop. Mm-hmm. We need to keep very focused on the accession package. Will come out in October or November, to be seen, with our new enlargement package, and you will see for all countries there will be detailed recommendations in this field, and that is the polar star that the countries need to follow. Let us not have any distractions. This is what they need to do. They will have to deliver, because otherwise they will not advance. And as you said earlier on, and I think Christina is probably the best illustration amongst many of them, they want it. They actually want it, so they are doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fundamental also to build confidence in the EU that an enlarged single market would have universal application of the rule of law, that European companies, for example, can get a fair hearing in the courts in any of those countries, as well as being fundamental for democracy and ensuring that standards are maintained. So, Christina, I wanted to ask you a bit more about an issue that you raised earlier about this whole question of administrative capacity, because it's a very tough thing. There's the fundamentals first policy that Jan was just outlining. There's a huge amount to do to take on the famous, now about 200,000 pages of acquis communautaire and write it into national law. And there's also a great deal to do because the EU keeps expanding its acquis and expanding itself as countries run to catch up in order to join. This is very challenging for a country the size of Moldova, with a small national administration. A lot of people like yourself have come back from international institutions who've worked abroad. It's great that they are involved. but it's really challenging. It was challenging for Poland, a country of 40 million people. It's been very challenging for some of the Western Balkan countries, which are smaller than Moldova. How do you see this going forward? How to manage this while also doing all the other things that are essential, like encouraging investment, giving business confidence that the accession process will actually bring more opportunities? How are you going to manage this?
Indeed, many of the candidate countries had a bit more time to prepare their administrations for the accession negotiations. We've just set up a new institution called the Bureau for European Integration this March. We are bringing in new civil servants, particularly working on European integration in each of the ministries. I've been reassured that Moldova is not the only country who has started with very low capacity. We're now trying to see how we can build that pretty fast. So I would say here we're benefiting a lot of the trainings offered on, let's say, EU law to particular segments of the acquis, what it means for us, what it means implementing that. So we're trying to bring in as many trainings as possible for our civil servants. We're trying to bring new people to the public administration. Public administration has not been, let's say, very popular among young people. Now we have adopted, or we have a new internship program that allows you to have an internship for 6 months in the government, and then you can get a job in the government if you're good. So we have managed to bring in more people via this instrument. We're working also with our diaspora. We have a lot of highly skilled Moldovans who work abroad, and they are trying to help us also at distance, so working remotely with us, but also some of them are considering coming back, and as you have mentioned, many of them have already come back to help the current administration. I think as we move forward, on the one hand, we have this dilemma, we don't want to enlarge too much our government, our public administration. On the other hand, we're very realistic about the fact that the work is only going to increase much more, so we need to, make our work way more efficient, and for that, again, I think trainings on the job is something that we're looking forward. In terms of your second question on how we can, whether this is going to help Moldova's potential for further investments, I think generally having opened accession talks with the EU should already be a boost of credibility that Moldova is on the right path. Of course, strengthening rule of law, cleaning up the judiciary of the corrupt elements that are still there is a core component of that. We're moving very fast with that. But at the same time, we need to be mindful also of the security situation. Being a country that shares 1,200 kilometers of direct border with Ukraine is still of a concern for some of the investors. But bringing in investment, making sure that we spur economic growth is really the bedrock for all of the reforms that the government can and wants to continue with. So here there is a very, I would say, strong correlation between boosting investment in Moldova as a bedrock for what the government can continue doing on the reform side of things. And again, on the other hand, you have this circular, basically, relationship here, because the more we invest, the more we strengthen our rule of law, the more interest there will be on behalf of the investors to come to Moldova.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very interesting to see the way that Moldova is moving from being a primarily agricultural economy, kind of leapfrogging into, for example, the green transition, having very little industry, but having opportunities to be part of, a larger green energy market in Europe, for example. And the point you made earlier about the synchronization of the electricity systems already having happened. So yes, it's a really interesting opportunity. So we're going to come to questions. So think about your questions in the room. For those of you online, you can ask questions on Slido with the hashtag enlargement. And we already have some questions. So I'd like to put one of them to you, Jan, which is about the very vexed question of dates. There has always been, since 1993, I think probably before that, I think François Mitterrand was asked whether it would be a good idea to set a date for enlargement, and his answer was a very clear non. Whereas later Jacques Chirac claimed that all of the countries would join in 2000 to a resounding boo when it was very clear that they would not do so. So he lost some credibility there. Dates are very tricky things. They can be highly motivating. And they can cause enormous disappointment if they're not met. They can look as if they are a guarantee, and then countries can, sit back and relax. That's not something that I think the Commission would like to encourage. But they are also very important for focusing the mind and setting a time horizon. And I think that there were a significant dynamizing effect of, for example, setting the target date of 2004 and then later of 2007, the last time around. So one of our questions online is, do you find it realistic that Montenegro could finish the negotiating process in 2026 and become a member in 2028? And I think it would be useful to get your view on the idea of a 2030 target for at least one country joining the next enlargement, which Charles Michel, as European Council President, put forward. Is it helpful to do this? And if so, how?
Well, that's actually 3 or 4 questions. So maybe I start with Montenegro, because it's very practical. I spent a few days there a fortnight ago with the government, because the government is saying, listen, we want to wrap this up quickly. We want to go fast. The question is then, what does that mean, and how do you actually do it? So what the government has come forward with is a planning for how they want to introduce the reforms over time. And we have had very good technical discussions as to how that can be organized. And that planning aims at completing their reforms by 2026. Is that realistic? Well, it's ambitious, but I think it's realistic. However, obviously, it's not the decision of the European Commission to close a chapter. That's an intergovernmental conference, so 27 member states. I think what we can say is, actually, if we work together intensively, and if you really undertake the reforms according to a realistic timetable, then a schedule like this is something that we can definitely contemplate. So I personally think if the member states, well, let me start, if Montenegro actually delivers on this schedule, and we've broken down all the various chapters, the 33 chapters over time with provisional dates, it's very, very clear now what the closing benchmarks are, what needs to be done, so you can plan this, right? And actually the government is saying, okay, we're going to translate this into mandates, not just for ministers, but the ministers are going to give these mandates to their civil servants, all the way down to the desk officers who have to deliver this piece of legislation by a certain date. So is that realistic? Yes. If it is done, is it helpful? I think what I clearly see is that in terms of the motivation in the country itself, it's very helpful. It is transformative, because then you'll have the government meeting every single week when they meet in the cabinet, reviewing the progress. So it transforms something that is very, if I can use this word, process-orientated into something that becomes completely results-driven. And I've actually, in my own DG, asked people not to put the word process in any documents. Process is killing for motivation. Results are motivating. So I think it is very helpful from that perspective. We need to manage expectations, and that is the last point I would make, because ultimately the 27 need to agree unanimously. Are they ready? I don't know whether they're ready today. But I personally think that for the incoming Commission, working with the Member States, having a fresh debate about accession in this new world we live in is absolutely fundamental. I think, as an economist, when I look at this and I look at the geopolitical world we live in, for me it's a bit of a no-brainer that there will be huge benefits and that we will be worse off in the counterfactual of leaving them outside. But that is not the view that is universal, to put it mildly, in many of our member states. So we need to have an open debate. We also need to confront, in a very objective manner and open manner, the concerns that are out there. If we don't do that, it's going to get hard. So I can't prejudge what the next Commission will do, but I will recommend that we work on this domestic conversation. And then I think if we look at it from that perspective, it's a much more productive way of working together in a very results-oriented manner, rather than having a big debate about whether we should fix a target for 2030. I think this is the wrong way round. Thank you.
Great. And an issue that you didn't mention, but which will be very important for particularly the Council presidencies and the European Council to think about is it really feasible to have a series of ratification processes? Imagine if national parliaments are asked 1 year after the next, okay, Montenegro, please decide on this year. Next year, maybe North Macedonia. Next year, to avoid that, the EU has done packages before. That's why there was a big bang enlargement of 10 countries in 2004. So there was just one big ratification. But that also can be tricky because it raises the stakes and it might mean that more countries get rejected or held up by a particular member state. So the politics of this are going to be quite tricky. So do we have questions in the room? I have more on Slido, but please go ahead. And please, the microphone is coming to you. Just please remind us who you are and ask a short question. Yeah, please.
Kurt Geisert. I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. I have a question for Mr. Koopman. If you compare the actual enlargement process with the enlargement process before 2004, are there more similarities or more differences?
Okay.
I think, to be honest, the world we live in today is really a very, very different world. But fundamentally, enlargement is about becoming an EU country, having a legal system, an operational system for your society and your economy that is European. So that hasn't changed. What is important, I think Heather made the point that the acquis these days is 200,000 pages. It was probably less than half of it in 2004. So enlargement is harder. It's hard work. That's what I always tell the chief negotiators. It's very, very hard work. I think the geopolitical context has also changed. The security dimension was absent. So I think the fundamental issue, the fundamental task hasn't changed, but the context in which we work and the efforts that need to be made have changed dramatically, and that's why this progressive integration dimension is so important. I think if we were to try to replicate the approach in 2004, where you negotiate, you enter, and then you have the benefits and the costs, there will be no enlargement. That's why progressive integration is absolutely central.
I might add that before the 2004 enlargement, there was nobody opposing it. Russia was actually fine with enlargement before 2004, so it's a very different situation now. Question here from the EBRD.
Thank you. Yes, good morning. My name is Wolfgang Schläger. I'm the head of the office from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Brussels. Actually, my colleague Milica was supposed to be on the panel, but she couldn't come for family reasons. So I'm also following now the enlargement process since a long time, 1999, and I'm so happy that it's really back and the new dynamic and the capacity. So, but what can we do even better together? There's a lot of things which now DG NEAR is putting together for the IFAs together with the Commission to push for reforms. But what is the top priority we should all focus on? Thank you.
Christina, would you like to go into that? And of course, having worked at the World Bank yourself, you know very well how multilateral banks operate in this area. Is there more that can be done?
I think we have a very good cooperation with the EBRD and with other organizations at the moment. I think what we appreciate is also the fact that they are flexible considering the accelerated speed that Moldova has been on lately, and that is something which is helping us, meet the challenges of the day, but also move with the speed that we have set for ourselves to move on. I would say that a big challenge that comes out, and we haven't yet discussed this, but we will discuss this in various ways, is as we're moving through the screening process, we started identifying lists and lists of IT systems that we need to put in place, not only to digitalize our society, but to be interoperable with the systems that exist in the EU, and these ones are extremely expensive here. And I'm sure we'll find ways to how to cooperate on this. But I think this is at this moment, something that we are identifying through the screening process. And I'm sure once we'll be done with all of it, we'll understand way better the entire scope of the work that is ahead of us. We're just at the beginning of the process at this moment. But once we move on with the screening, we will see exactly, the scope of the work ahead of us. And I very much appreciate once again the fact that particularly organizations like EBRD are much more flexible towards our needs and making sure that you're adapting for us to meet them.
So we have a question online about what does the EU get out of enlargement? What are the kind of benefits that the EU should expect in areas like the internal market, also green energy and the green transition more broadly, natural resources? And this is an area that I think was somewhat neglected in previous enlargements. There wasn't that much public communication about the benefits, particularly economic benefits for the EU itself. And yet the larger single market has, of course, grown. And thanks to enlargement and the dynamism of countries that have come in with a lot of catch-up growth to do, and also increased, of course, cross-border trade, investment, and so on. It's not just the candidate countries themselves that benefit. So, Hedyan, are there plans to make assessments of the potential benefits for the EU member states more broadly, more widely available? Do we need something like a Cecchini report on the costs of non-enlargement, both security-wise, but also in terms of economics? Could that be a plan for the next Commission?
Absolutely. Well, having worked in DG2, as it was called at the time when the Cecchini report was done, it is something that indeed we have also discussed internally. And yes, I think it is absolutely essential. Many people see enlargement as a burden. It certainly is a transformation also for us, but the advantages are significant. And I refer to the debates we need to have with our member states, in our member states, and I think these benefits also need to be discussed. Mm-hmm. If you go back to 2004, what we've seen is that many industries in Europe, they relocated their supply chains within Europe, and countries like the Czech Republic became the workhorse, really, of the industry, which was good for them, but was actually also very good for industry. Taking
German car makers, for example.
German car makers, exactly. So, I think very similar mechanisms will come into play now. Ukraine is a very special case. It's also potentially a huge reservoir for clean energy, the world's largest producer of many agricultural goods, which also geopolitically and strategically, vis-a-vis a continent like Africa, offers all sorts of opportunities, which are, frankly speaking, not really being discussed at all. So yes, I do believe that we need a much more informed debate about it. We also need to be honest. Is not true to say that enlargement in terms of economic effects has been good for every single worker in the EU, for every single region in the EU. Economies don't work like that as they adjust. So we need to be clear about that. I think it's very, very sad that we have a debate only about the costs, but it would be a big mistake if we, went all the way to simply saying it's all going to be great for everyone, the economic benefits will be massive. I think the economic benefits will be not insignificant, but they will be differentiated, and that is something we also need to apprehend.
And also the costs of non-enlargement. If we were to lose countries to an enlarged Russian sphere of influence, for example, Absolutely. Or indeed have basket case economies with huge amounts of corruption and organised crime on our borders.
Yeah. Listen, I think if this enlargement goes wrong, and we go back to where we were maybe 5-6 years ago in the Western Balkans, and if Ukraine is lost and Moldova is lost, having very, very difficult situations on our borders with, honestly, populations that will not just be demotivated but will become extremely cynical. If you look at Ukraine, a country where there are probably more firearms than people, I think that is a prospect which I'm sure no one really wants to entertain seriously.
Yeah, from that point of view, one could think of enlargement policy as a way of managing challenges. Often it's seen as, we're going to bring all these problems into the EU, but those problems are there regardless. The question is, how do you manage them? Question here in the front row. The microphone is just coming, hang on. Just remind us who you are.
Sergei Kasyanov, Harvard Aerospace and Defense. I'm interested, how would the accession, for instance, Ukraine, affect European Union defense sector? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question to which there's a very, very long answer. But maybe just a few points. I think by taking in a country that will be essentially, if we manage, right, confronted with a frozen conflict, we will have a security situation that we will need to take extremely seriously in a way that we never have done before. Secondly, we will need to make sure the country is able to withstand any future aggression, which means that the link between the situation in Ukraine and the debate about a European defense capacity will be there. It's already there, and I think it only strengthens the argument for taking this much more seriously, which brings you into a whole debate about how you organize it. Practically speaking, there's a lot that we can do actually through procurement already today, and there's a lot we can do through reconstruction in Ukraine, where, let us not mince our words, Ukraine is actually probably the most innovative place when it comes to producing armaments in the world today. And that is because the country needs to survive. It's an existential question in the most literal sense of the word. But potentially it's also something, if we look forward into the future, that we can benefit from. So this dimension, which is really something we haven't seen before in enlargement, will be extremely prominent.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, Ukraine has, for all the wrong reasons, the largest army in Europe and the only one with very recent current experience of fighting a war. I mean, one of the questions I think is, in terms of defense, could Ukraine join NATO before joining the EU, which is what has always happened before. That's what happened to all of the 2004, 2007 incomers. So there are a lot of questions about that. This issue is, by the way, tackled along with others in a Bruegel paper on Ukraine's accession path towards the European Union that a Bruegel team put together. I think we produced it in April this year, so you can find it online. And if I may be allowed another advertisement for a Bruegel paper relating to something else that Jan was talking about, which is Ukraine's potential for green energy. There's work on that going on in Bruegel, also in collaboration with a very good NGO called Green Deal Ukraine in Kiev. My colleague Georg Zachman is working on that subject. But Ukraine's potential for exporting electricity to the European Union. Moldova also has this potential, it's a much smaller country, but nonetheless, to have an integrated grid with wind power as well as solar from countries that have more land availability because they are less densely populated than most of the European Union is, as well as all of the possibilities that are made there because of having an oversized electricity grid left from Soviet times. But of course, the investment needs are enormous. So I wanted to ask about this investment question. There are a couple of questions coming on Slido about what are the investment opportunities for European countries in areas like health. Now, the growth plan for the Western Balkans, which I think was your brainchild, Jan, when you came in as the new Director General, aims to promote foreign direct investment as a major means of helping to transform countries before accession. Now, that was a motor for economic transformation in Central Europe. Hungary and Estonia got massive levels of FDI per capita, and that helped their economies to transform. We're in a very different situation now with much less liquid capital available globally. And frankly, the Western Balkans, for example, has attracted very little FDI. Ukraine, there's all of the challenges of the war. And Moldova, there are the challenges of not being very well known and being a relatively small economy. So how could FDI be increased? Is it a matter of promoting sectoral opportunities, or is it a matter of showing the chances because the accession process provides more guarantees for business of regulatory predictability, because you know that these countries will take on all of the EU's rules and regulations. So is it about the broad picture, or is it about specific opportunities?
For Moldova, as you said, it's quite a small economy. At this point, we are planning to invest heavily in renewables. So this is a latest opportunity for us as we move away from Russian gas, as we move closer to green agenda is a key priority for us. And here we have just recently launched tenders on renewables. I think this is a good investment opportunity in Moldova. We have quite a competitive IT sector in Moldova. That is also something where investors could be interested in Moldova. Textiles as well, as you said, you were moving a little bit away from being seen as an agricultural country, but still this is a sector that we intend on developing, particularly sectors that are more competitive for us as a country, be it wines, and there is already a lot of investments in this sector for us.
Yes, I must say, if I were to do a hot tip, I would say invest in Moldovan wine. It's really very impressive. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think this is absolutely fundamental. What triggered the growth plan is really the realization that these countries are not growing at 6-7% as our generation, the class of 24 was. And this is a problem for many different reasons. I think FDI is one important vector for growth, but it's only one. However, it is very important, given that it brings a lot of technological transfer with it. You asked, what is more important? Is it the structural issues, or do we need to work directly with companies? My view, it's both. Structural issues are taken care of under the enlargement process. We talked a lot about the importance of rule of law, absolutely fundamental. But also the growth plan has selected, if you will, and made conditional significant support on critical fundamental reforms and socio-economic reforms. The business environment, with every respect, in many of these countries is simply not conducive to FDI. So that's being fixed. The roadmap there is very clear. It's a bit like what we have done internally in the EU with Next Generation EU. That's where the inspiration came from. But I think it's not enough. I think there is a hesitation amongst the European businesses, and also, frankly speaking, some of these countries are small. They don't know Montenegro. Many people cannot even point Montenegro on the map. It would be an interesting test to ask European CEOs to identify Chisinau on the map. I'm not sure that all of them would succeed. So one of the things we're doing is actually working in a very proactive way with the candidate countries, organizing big investment conferences, which are not just a talking shop, but here the idea is actually to work very closely to see what can be done to reverse this process of inaction, and to get companies to actually look at this together with the government. It's a bit of an experiment. We're doing it primarily in our candidate countries, but we're also doing it in our wider neighborhood. And I personally think, because of the nature of the countries, it is actually absolutely fundamental as an ingredient for driving economic growth.
Thank you very much. We are out of time, so we'll have to finish this session at this point. Lots more to discuss, which we hope to do in the future, both through Bruegel's research, but also as we see the Commission starting to take up its new agenda for the next 5 years. I just want to close by thanking our speakers for their frankness and the amount of detail that they've given us today on the road ahead, and for discussing some huge range of issues. Enlargement is a wonderful subject because it's politics, it's economics, it's defense and security, it's all of these things wrapped into one. And thank you for discussing it so ably with us.
Thanks for having us.